Hello, all of you beautiful, brilliant human beings. Hey, Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I decided I needed a social media break. So I removed Instagram from my phone. And besides going on Facebook for my Worthy Women Rise groups that I'm leading right now, I'm trying to be off of social media as much as possible. But with everything going on right now, I just wanted to hop on the platform that I can use, which is this platform, podcast, to talk a little bit about my thoughts around everything that's going on, and also to not talk about what's going on. In that, I think everyone has an opinion about what's happening, and I'm not sure if inundating ourselves with different opinions is necessarily helpful. I have noticed my mental health become really fragile during this time. I'm noticing myself be a lot more sensitive, take things a lot more personally, find myself going into the spiraling of scrolling through Facebook, even though I've committed to being off social media, noticing myself doing a lot of things that's not ultimately helpful for my mental health, because uncertainty is hard. It's hard to not know what's going to happen. And certainty is in many ways an important facet of grounding our mental health. So without certainty, panic sets in. Our vision gets narrowed. Our nervous system is activated. And we tend to kind of operate from that panic and that fear more so than the prefrontal cortex and higher thinking and thoughtfulness. So wanted to come out of my social media hiatus to drop this podcast episode for you all, where I'm going to share some thoughts I have about slowing it down, what it has meant for me in my life, and maybe it will support you navigating everything that's going on right now with the coronavirus. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. The other day, I was in the shower. This is probably, I want to say 3 weeks ago. And I just had this thought of what I wanted to share as a podcast episode. And I wanted to title it The Urgency to Die. But felt like maybe that would be a little bit too clickbaity. And I don't mean to cause more alarm. But that thought, this urgency to die, has been landing in my heart over and over and over again in terms of how often we structure our lives with a sense of urgency. And of course, we do this as a response to our culture, to the systems that are in place. Even entrepreneurs, I operate with a sense of urgency. I give myself deadlines, I put things in place, and then I get very stressed over those deadlines, even though I'm the one that placed those deadlines in the first place, and I can easily shift and restructure it to make sense for me. There is a sense of urgency in our lives. There's an urgency to grow, right? There's an urgency to learn and master. There's an urgency to perfect. There is an urgency to fix. There is an urgency to do better. And while there is complexity in this urgency, while so much of what propels us forward is a momentum that comes from urgency, I also have become really mindful of how that urgency, there's birds tweeting outside, which is really lovely, making lovely background noise for me as I record this. There is often, I think, there's a good of the urgency. We want people, for example, in the hospitals to be working urgently, right? Urgency isn't the problem here. The problem is, I think, not maybe problem, but the opportunity, the exploration is that there tends to be a lot of urgency where there doesn't need to be urgency. One of the ways that I tend to see this urgency play out is in the times that we are expected to respond, and how often we tend to feel the need to respond as quickly as possible. We have to make decisions quickly. We have to move on to the next. We have to do things at lightning speed. And I wonder about that. And I wonder what that's about and why we do that. What is the urgency? Why are we running so hard to our inevitable demise, to our inevitable deaths? We will die. So why are we running so hard towards it? And I think, so much of the pain, so much of the running, so much of the reactivity, so much of the push, and urgency and the doing stems from a real valid desire to run away from our emotions. So actually not be in the experience of being human at this point in time. Because being human is very complex. It's very difficult. It's very painful in many aspects of humanity. Of course, there's so much joy also in being human. Pleasure, right, is only available truly in the present. In order for us to orgasm, in order for us to really enjoy a meal, in order for us to truly take in a sunset, we have to just be grounded in here. We have to let it in. We have to be present in our experience. Those things we try to slow down for, but we're so accustomed to the speed in which we live our lives that it becomes almost impossible for us to slow down, even when we so desperately want to. Even when we know that the way we can increase the vitality between our partners in terms of our sex life, in terms of our communication, is to slow it down and be present and be here with them. We are so accustomed, adjusted to the running so that we don't have to be in the experience of being human, running so we just avoid our emotions, running so we avoid the pain. Look at how we are responding to this pandemic. Look at the crisis of toilet paper shortage, right? Look at the panic. Look at the ways that we are hoarding and, acting very much from a primitive brain of thinking only about ourselves and our family and our needs. This reactivity is valid because we're so terrified of the uncertainty and we're trying so hard to be certain. It is valid because this is humanity. Fear is allowed. Fear is normal. Fear is necessary. Fear protects us. There's nothing wrong with fear. There's nothing wrong with panic. And if we don't have the systems in place to slow it down, all that fear and that panic is doing is creating more fear and more panic and leading to shortages that are directly impacting the people that need it the most. Running to buy all of the masks takes masks away from the healthcare workers who actually need them, right? So anyway, I've been thinking about this way before the kind of the coronavirus became the pandemic that it is, but I think it's really fitting to be thinking about this now. So many of us are in quarantine or have self-quarantined. So many of us are choosing to structure their lives so that they can be at home. And that's not an option for so many people. So my heart goes out to all of the people who can't do that, or all of the people who have done that, have chosen to do that. Now means that you're not making income. Hard decisions are being made right now. And of course, the people that are going to be mostly impacted by this are people who are more marginalized in whatever way, whether that's autoimmune marginalization, right, health marginalization, whether that's socioeconomic status marginalization. Anyway, we all know. We don't need to go there here. What's coming up in our world right now, as we are invited to quarantine, is a realization, I think, that we actually spend a lot of our lives in the doing. And I'm noticing this myself as I am here at home, how often I'm tuning into other people's narratives and other people's experiences instead of my own. Whether that's through reading or books, podcasts, whether it's through TV, whether it's through talking to other people. There is so much of taking in of other people's energy and not a lot of sitting with my own. Again, emphasizing that there's nothing wrong with all of those things. There's nothing wrong with connecting with people or reading a book or doing whatever it is you're doing. But I'm noticing for myself that it's much easier for me to fill the void than to sit with the void. It's hard for me to sit with the mystery of life, to sit with the uncertainty. And yet, I have a feeling that that's just not only my experience, that it's actually many of our experiences where life is mysterious. We never would have predicted even a few months ago that this would be where we are in the world right now. We never would have predicted. There is a sort of tension of being human, a tension of the not knowing how things are going to come together, not knowing if the relationship is going to work out, not knowing if this job promotion is going to pan out, not knowing. It's all here. But instead of being with the tension, what we often tend to do is react from the tension, to try to alleviate the tension by fixing, try to alleviate the tension by shutting down, numbing out, cutting out, cutting people, hurting people, by not thinking about other people, by letting other people consume us. All of this is a way that I think that we avoid being in the tension. I had a conversation with a friend the other day, and we were talking about a friendship of mine that has gone through some really hard ups and downs, beautiful ups, very hard downs, kind of unclear as to where this friendship is going to go in the future, and very much wanting to know, like very much wanting to have like continual conversations with this friend until we figure out what's happening here. Like, what are we doing? And so the friend that I was talking to about all this, she, said to me, Tace, what if you could just be in the tension of the not knowing of where this friendship is going to go right now and just trust the timing? Trust that you don't have to have it all resolved right now for the relationship to be real. That you can continue to be thinking about that person and thinking about how you want this relationship to move forward without letting it consume you. What if we could just be in the tension without letting it annihilate us? And I think that that's a really beautiful, small example of a larger example that we're all sitting with. It's like, what if we could sit in the tension of not knowing how this is going to turn out, not knowing what this is going to elicit in the world, not knowing what is going to be affected without letting it consume us, giving us ourselves a sense of certainty that feels right and letting go of the rest. For example, it may feel really right now for you to have food for yourself for the next 2 weeks without having to leave the home. Maybe that feels like the type of care that you need to put to yourself and towards the situation. But then maybe you limit how much information about what's happening in the world come into your life. Maybe you can check in once a day. Maybe you can check in, not in the morning, not in the evening, but in the middle of the day where you have time to process that information and then move forward. What are we doing when we are continually checking into the spiral of panic, right? Is that we're activating our nervous system and compromising our immune system. And I'm noticing that for myself. That all of the panic is a desire to run away from what is here, to run away with the uncertainty of being human. And so that's the ironic part of this, right? Is that by being reactive and busy, constantly busy and doing and planning and doing, we're running towards death while at the same time terrified of death. And that's what all that running is right? Is a sense of being terrified of our very sensitive ecosystem that is what it means to be human in the world. Always. It has always been this way. Being human has always been an extremely sensitive enterprise. Death is a constant in nature. We see it all the time. Animals die and born and die and born. And yet, when it comes to being human, the idea of death, the idea of moving, towards death and aging is terrifying, and we avoid it at all costs. This leads to a lot of anxiety. And so I've been sitting with this. This idea of slowing down, I've heard this term, this concept for over 10 years, studying Buddhist principles and traditions and the Hindu traditions and even Christian traditions. I mean, all of the large kind of spiritual and religious understandings have some indoctrination, some lecture, some understanding of slowing down, of being present, right? So I've known about this concept of slowing down for a very long time. And yet, it's only been recently, in the past few months, that I've really come to understand what that means for me. Slowing down for me doesn't mean just meditating 20 minutes a day and then going on in my life. Slowing down for me is more of a moment-to-moment invitation to slow down my reactive time. Because right now, we live in such a technological age where most of our exchanges happen through text and email. We have that divine gift of really not forcing ourselves to respond right away. We don't actually have to respond right away. We get to sit with something that somebody said. We get to digest things. In the intuitive eating community, there is an encouragement for people to actually chew their foods. And the more that we practice mindfulness eating and intuitive eating and really recognize our relationship with food, I think we often realize that wow, we really don't chew our foods, right? We kind of do a chew swallow situation. And dogs do this beautifully. I mean, my dog Chewy, you'll give him something that you imagine would take a long time for him to chew, and he just chews it and swallows it whole. And it's we do this, right? We do this with food. We do this in so many other ways where we don't really let ourselves digest what's happening before moving on to the next. So this is what it means for me to slow down, to give myself space between the stimulus to respond in a way that allows me to have processed some of it before moving on to the next. This is what it means to be in attention. This is what it means to give ourselves the capacity to trust that as we allow more of life inward and process it and give ourselves space to feel what needs to be felt, we can respond in a way that's more intelligent, that's more robust, that encompasses more complexity, both of the other human and of ourselves. And this is part of the pleasure and the joy of being a life coach and also a therapist, is really noticing how often I'm listening to someone else share their struggle, share their pain, share what's going on for them. And I'm noticing that I'm a few steps ahead of them, right? That I'm already formulating why this is happening. And I want them to get there. I want them to get to the place where they understand. And so sometimes what I find myself doing is telling them, what I'm seeing. And listen, sometimes this is helpful, but I'm talking about the few instances that I've done this where I actually realize after a session is over that I wasn't really on the same page with them at all the whole session, because the whole session I was spent trying to get them to be where they're not. And so slowing down here in this moment in time, in the complexity of the human experience, is really about knowing how to meet people where they are and knowing how to meet ourselves where we are. Knowing that our culture, our society really pushes us to be somewhere we're not, to be more advanced, to be more, to be smarter, to be faster, to be better. That is a pressure of our culture. We actually now get to really be here in our humanness. We get to meet ourselves in our limitations. We get to say, I'm actually still processing this. I'm actually still digesting something that has happened a long time ago. This is radically different than this idea of moving on and let it go and everything happens for a reason. This is the opposite of that. This is a sweet attunement to what is here right now. Meeting ourselves where we are at is the antithesis of running away from our emotions, because it forces us to settle into our bones, to settle into what is here. This is the magic we have been waiting for. What's happening in our world is that by a mass scale, we are forced to slow it down, to be with ourselves, to be gentle with ourselves, to be reminded that the human experience is very, very sensitive. So why then are we so urgently running towards death? And can we instead allow ourselves to digest what is here? That digestion is what allows us to then emit or be in a sense of care for one another, right? Because the reactivity, the panic comes from our reptilian brain. Our sense of urgency typically comes from our limbic, our emotional brain, telling us fight, flight, freeze. if we want to dig into a space of caring for others, that's going to come from our prefrontal cortex. That's going to come from giving ourselves space to be in the fear and not let it take over, to breathe, to allow our emotions to be here. And as we do that, we can step into a greater sense of self where we then actually get to care for other human beings instead of just thinking about our own pain. That care, that meeting people where they're at, means being very mindful of our consumption right now, knowing that things are in some ways limited and there are people who may need it more than us. We get to be mindful of that. We get to be in care for other humans during a time when we're being kind of told unconsciously that right now we have to avoid all humanity, right? There's ways that we can care. There's ways we can connect. There's ways that we can be together in this experience that's not so isolating. And we get to get curious about what that feels like for us and how that feels right. What feels right in terms of connecting with people right now? What feels right in terms of extending care? Yeah? One more note on this. Integrating the work that we've been doing, whether that's self-development work, healing work, whatever you consider work, having that go from knowing it to actually doing it, that difference from mentalizing it to internalizing it, that gap, that space is space. That means that the more we give ourselves space to integrate, the more integration can take place. Integration requires space. Space to not do, space to not fix, space to not be in the panic, space to be in our bodies, space to slow it down. And whatever your experience is of what's happening right now, there is always an invitation for us to create more space internally. This is what is required for the integration. This is what is required for us to tap into our fullness so that we can kind of hold the complexity, the mystery of life without letting it consume us. Listen, certainty is a really important thing for our psyche. So I'm not saying that, we have to be okay in uncertainty, whatever that means to be okay. We can be okay. We can acknowledge that it's not very easy to be okay in uncertainty. Right? We can acknowledge that this is also all really, really hard. And we can also maybe breathe into that nothing was ever certain. Nothing is ever certain. And that while so much of our lives is uncertain, we get to cultivate certainty within us. And this previous episode of Reclaim, when I talk about control, also can be really helpful in this conversation. Okay, so that's my a 22-ish minute lecture on a shower thought that I had about this urgency to die and our compulsive need to avoid being human by distracting and being in the busyness. And right now, things are hard. Can we be gentle with our mental health? And something that my therapist said to me today, can we remember also that we are allowed to be in joy? We are allowed to experience joy and celebration right now. There's a lot to celebrate. I personally I've been going to a website called goodnewsnetwork.org. It's really nice to kind of go through and read articles of good things happening in the world as a way to kind of balance out everything that's been going on. There's a lot of really good. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot to celebrate every day that we get to live, and let us not forget to make space for that joy as well, because that's an essential part of this experience is to have joy. And the urgency to die, the running towards death, it really distracts us, right, from the fact that there is joy in every moment, like the birds that are twittering outside my windows right now. I live in the middle of Los Angeles, and it's so beautiful that I found this little pocket of the city where there's birds outside my window. Can I be in joy of that? I have a fiddle leaf fig that I bought for this apartment that I love. And I recently moved the fiddle leaf, try to get it to be more balanced in its growth. And one of the branches is completely in the apartment. And it's just so big and beautiful. no matter where you are in my living area, your eyes gravitate towards this fiddly fig. And it's just so beautiful how it continues to grow, and it continues to trust the light, and it continues to move forward, even in times of uncertainty. My partner and I have jokes about what to call this fiddly fig. Initially, her name was, or I don't even know why I'm gendering my plant. Their name was Figlet for piglet, but Figlet, love that. But my partner loves the name Figgy Azalea. I love that. But recently, I've been really adamant on naming my fiddly fig Figmund Freud. Right? I mean, Figmund Freud. 2 psychology students, me and my partner. Of course, the fiddly fig has to be called Figmund Freud. So anyway, Joy gets to be here, my loves. Go find it. Go access it. It's available here. Make space for it. Take care of yourself. Wash your hands. Separate yourselves from other people physically for a little bit. But do not forget that connection is everywhere. We get to connect with each other in every way that feels available except physically. You know, we don't have to do this alone. All of us are in this experience together. And so while I may continue my social media break for a little while longer, just know I'm thinking all of you. You're welcome to reach out to me, email me, info@thaissky.com. Tell me how you're doing. Let me know. I am here. I'm not going anywhere. I will be sharing my process of integration with you for many moons to come. See, that's the certainty, right? That I believe that that's available for me. But even if that's not, can we be in that tension and the mystery of showing up right now? Grateful for all of you for listening to this podcast. And I will talk to you all soon. Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.